Tonight, as the year closes and the noise of American politics reaches a familiar fever pitch, we are confronted with something deeper than headlines. We are witnessing symptoms, not accidents, of a system under strain. When a former president releases an end of year message that feels unhinged, when the shadow of the Epstein files hangs over powerful institutions, and when cultural and political battles resurface under new names and old fears, we are not watching chaos. We are watching contradictions finally speak out loud. The message in the moment. Let us begin with that end of year message. It is loud, emotional, and deliberately provocative. But strip away the theatrics, and what remains is insecurity. Systems that are confident do not shout. Leaders who feel secure do not rage at shadows. This message is not about strength, it is about fragility, the fragility of a political order that promises stability while delivering anxiety, debt, and declining trust. The anger we hear is not just personal, it is structural, born from an economy that concentrates wealth at the top while asking the majority to applaud from below, a looming deadline no one can ignore. Now consider the Epstein files and the looming deadline attached to them. This is not gossip, it is a test of whether the rule of law applies equally or whether it bends quietly for the wealthy and well connected. Every delay, every legal maneuver, every act of silence sends a message far louder than any campaign speech that power still protects itself. And here is the hook we must not miss. When justice becomes optional for elites, democracy becomes optional for everyone else. Distraction is strategy, and into this volatile mix comes the return of cultural flashpoints, repackaged, renamed, and reintroduced to divide attention. These moments are not random, they function as distractions, carefully timed to pull public anger sideways instead of upward. When people argue endlessly over symbols, they stop asking harder questions about wages, healthcare, housing, and debt. This is not culture replacing economics. It is culture being used to hide economics. The bigger picture. What ties all of this together is not personality, scandal, or spectacle. It is a system that has learned to survive by confusing the public. Outrage replaces analysis. Drama replaces accountability. And the media cycle spins faster, ensuring we react before we think. But history teaches us something important. Systems do not collapse because people talk too much. They collapse when people finally understand what they are seeing. A choice at year's end. As this year ends, the real question is not what one politician said, or which file gets released, or which controversy trends tomorrow. The question is whether the public continues to accept noise as leadership and distraction as governance. Because once people connect these dots, once they see how economic power, political messaging, and manufactured conflict work together, the performance loses its power. Trump's end of year message is revealing not because it is shocking, but because of what it unintentionally exposes about the current state of political power. The volume, the urgency, and the confrontational tone are not marks of confidence. They are indicators of a system and a leadership style under pressure. When political communication shifts from persuasion to provocation, it suggests that traditional methods of maintaining loyalty and control are losing their effectiveness. This is not accidental rhetoric, it is a strategic response to a shrinking base of trust and a growing sense of instability. The message leans heavily on grievance, exaggeration, and emotional escalation, all of which function as tools to mobilize fear rather than offer direction. This approach thrives in moments when leadership feels threatened by changing realities, legal challenges, institutional resistance, demographic shifts, or economic dissatisfaction. The louder the message, the more it attempts to drown out uncertainty. But audiences increasingly recognize this pattern, and that recognition weakens the illusion of authority. Power that feels secure does not need to shout. It relies on outcomes, not outrage. There is also an economic context beneath the theatrics that cannot be ignored. Rising inequality, unaffordable housing, medical debt, and stagnant wages have eroded public patience. When these material pressures intensify, political messaging often becomes more extreme because symbolic conflict is easier to manage than structural reform. The end of year message does not address these realities directly. Instead, it redirects frustration toward enemies, conspiracies, and cultural battles. That redirection is itself evidence of fragility. If the system were delivering stability, it would not require constant emotional agitation to maintain support. Another critical signal embedded in the message is its dependence on perpetual crisis. Everything is framed as an emergency, a betrayal, or an existential threat. This narrative style keeps audiences emotionally engaged but intellectually stalled. It prevents reflection, discourages nuance, and conditions listeners to react rather than evaluate. Over time, however, crisis fatigue sets in. When every moment is described as unprecedented, nothing feels resolvable. That exhaustion further reveals weakness because sustainable power depends on credibility, not continuous alarm. The timing of such a message is equally important. End of year addresses traditionally project closure, reassurance, or vision. Deviating from that pattern suggests an inability to offer resolution. Instead of signaling control over events, the message appears to chase them. This reversal is subtle but significant. Leaders who shape narratives lead, those who chase narratives follow. Viewers sense this instinctively, even if they cannot articulate it. The emotional intensity, rather than inspiring confidence, amplifies doubts about stability and direction. What ultimately makes the message revealing is not what it says, but what it avoids. There is no calm articulation of policy success, no measured reflection on governance, and no credible roadmap forward. In their place are volume, repetition, and provocation. These are not signs of dominance, they are defensive maneuvers. And once audiences begin to interpret them as such, the message stops functioning as a show of strength and starts operating as evidence of a system struggling to maintain control. The approaching deadline surrounding the Epstein files carries a weight that goes far beyond any single case because it forces a direct confrontation with how justice actually functions when wealth and influence are involved. This moment has become a measure of institutional credibility. Every extension, sealed document, or procedural delay sends a signal, and the public is paying attention. The central issue is not curiosity or scandal. It is whether the legal system operates as a neutral framework or as a flexible shield for those positioned at the top of economic and political hierarchies. What makes this situation especially powerful is its visibility. Unlike many instances of elite protection that occur quietly, this one unfolds in public view, under media scrutiny, and widespread skepticism. That visibility transforms legal maneuvering into a political statement. When deadlines loom and accountability appears negotiable, it reinforces the perception that justice is conditional. The law may be written as universal, but its application begins to look selective, and that perception alone is enough to corrode public trust. The case also exposes how time itself is used as a weapon. Delays are not neutral. They exhaust attention, dilute outrage, and allow narratives to shift. As months pass, urgency fades, witnesses disappear from headlines, and the emotional impact weakens. This strategy benefits those with resources to sustain legal resistance indefinitely. For ordinary citizens, time is a constraint. For elites, it becomes leverage. That imbalance is one of the clearest demonstrations of unequal justice in practice, not theory. There is a deeper democratic implication embedded here. When people believe that powerful individuals are insulated from consequences, participation begins to feel pointless. Voting, civic engagement, and institutional trust decline not because people are apathetic, but because they are rationally responding to evidence that outcomes are predetermined. This erosion does not happen suddenly. It accumulates through moments like this, where accountability appears optional rather than mandatory. The Epstein files also intersect with broader economic realities. Systems that concentrate wealth inevitably concentrate legal power. High priced attorneys, complex jurisdictions, and prolonged litigation are luxuries unavailable to most. The legal process becomes another marketplace where access and endurance determine outcomes. This is not a flaw at the margins, it is a structural feature. The looming deadline forces that feature into the open, making it harder to dismiss as coincidence or anomaly. What keeps this moment alive is the unresolved tension between expectation and reality. Official rhetoric promises transparency, equal justice, and institutional integrity. Yet the observable behavior suggests caution, protection, and delay. That gap between promise and practice is where public anger grows. It is also where political legitimacy weakens. Institutions do not lose credibility because they make mistakes. They lose credibility when they appear to protect themselves rather than the public. The real hook in this moment is its simplicity. People do not need legal expertise to understand fairness. They understand deadlines, consequences, and accountability in their own lives. When those rules change at the top, the message is unmistakable. The looming deadline is not just about releasing files, it is about revealing whether the system answers to law or to power. The resurgence of cultural controversies during moments of political and economic stress is not accidental. It follows a well-worn pattern designed to redirect public attention. When economic pressures intensify and policy failures become harder to defend, symbolic conflicts move to the center of the conversation. These issues are emotionally charged, easy to personalize, and endlessly debatable, making them ideal tools for absorbing anger that might otherwise be directed at structural problems. The result is a public discourse that feels intense but produces very little clarity or accountability. What makes this strategy effective is its familiarity. Cultural disputes tap into identity, morality, and belonging, areas where people feel deeply invested. Unlike economic policy, which requires data, patience, and long term thinking, cultural arguments demand instant reactions. They create sides quickly and reward outrage over analysis. This dynamic keeps audiences engaged while quietly sidelining discussions about wages, healthcare access, housing costs, and debt burdens. The hook lies in the substitution itself. Emotional conflict replaces material reality. Media amplification plays a central role in sustaining this cycle. Outlets driven by ratings and algorithms prioritize content that provokes immediate response. Cultural flashpoints are tailor made for this environment, offering constant updates, viral moments, and simplified narratives. Meanwhile, economic stories that require sustained attention and systemic critique struggle to compete. The public ends up consuming a steady stream of cultural drama while the underlying economic conditions shaping daily life remain largely unchanged and under-examined. There is also a political convenience in this arrangement. Cultural debates fracture potential coalitions that might otherwise form around shared economic interests. Workers facing rising living costs, regardless of background, might find common ground if economic realities dominated the conversation. Cultural conflicts disrupt that possibility by encouraging people to see one another as adversaries rather than participants in the same economic system. Division becomes a substitute for reform, and disagreement becomes proof of engagement. Another revealing aspect is how these controversies are often recycled rather than resolved. The same themes resurface with new labels, new personalities, and renewed urgency, despite having little impact on policy outcomes. This repetition signals that their function is not problem solving, but distraction. If cultural battles truly addressed underlying issues, they would conclude. Instead, they linger, evolve, and return, ensuring a continuous diversion from economic accountability. The deeper consequence of this distraction is normalization. When cultural outrage dominates, economic instability becomes background noise. People adapt to rising costs and declining security as unavoidable facts of life while channeling frustration into debates that do not threaten power structures. Over time, this reshapes expectations. Demands for systemic change are replaced by demands for symbolic victories, which are easier to grant and easier to reverse. What keeps this mechanism effective is its subtlety. Few people feel manipulated, they feel engaged. The arguments feel personal, urgent, and meaningful. Yet the absence of sustained economic discussion speaks louder than any slogan. The recurring return of cultural flashpoints during periods of economic strain is not coincidence, it is a signal. It reveals a political environment more comfortable managing emotion than addressing inequality, and more invested in spectacle than in solutions. The modern political environment is increasingly shaped by spectacle rather than substance, and this shift has profound consequences for accountability. Media ecosystems now reward speed, conflict, and emotional intensity, creating an environment where dramatic moments overshadow meaningful scrutiny. In this setting, performance becomes more valuable than policy, and outrage becomes a substitute for explanation. The result is a political conversation that feels constantly urgent yet rarely informative, keeping audiences engaged while leaving fundamental questions unanswered. What makes spectacle so powerful is its ability to dominate attention. A viral clip, a provocative statement, or a heated exchange can eclipse weeks of investigative reporting or policy analysis. These moments are easy to consume and easy to share, requiring little context or critical effort. Accountability, by contrast, is slow and demanding. It requires follow up, documentation, and persistence. When spectacle takes precedence, the incentives shift away from those practices. Politicians learn that generating noise is often more effective than delivering results because noise controls the narrative. This dynamic fundamentally alters the relationship between media and power. Instead of acting as a mechanism of oversight, media platforms increasingly function as amplifiers. Statements are repeated, conflicts are framed as entertainment, and contradictions are treated as content rather than problems to be resolved. The hook is subtle but dangerous. When exposure replaces examination, visibility is mistaken for transparency. Being seen is no longer tied to being held responsible. Another consequence is the erosion of memory. Spectacle thrives on novelty, demanding constant replacement. Yesterday's controversy is forgotten as soon as today's arrives. This rapid turnover prevents sustained pressure on institutions or individuals. Accountability depends on continuity, the ability to track promises, revisit failures, and measure outcomes over time. Spectacle breaks that chain. It allows unresolved issues to disappear beneath the next wave of drama, leaving patterns of behavior intact and unchallenged. The audience is not passive in this process, but it is conditioned. Constant exposure to high intensity content reduces tolerance for complexity. Long explanations feel tedious, nuance feels evasive. This conditioning benefits those in power because complexity is where accountability lives. Simple narratives are easier to manipulate, easier to deny, and easier to redirect. When politics becomes entertainment, citizens are transformed into spectators rather than participants. Economic interests reinforce this shift. Attention is monetized, and spectacle generates attention efficiently. Platforms profit from engagement spikes, not from civic understanding. This creates structural pressure to prioritize conflict over clarity. Accountability does not trend, it accumulates. It rarely produces instant payoff, making it less attractive in an economy built around immediacy. The system, therefore, is not neutral. It actively favors spectacle because spectacle is profitable. What ultimately makes this transformation so effective is that it does not feel like control, it feels like access. People feel closer to power because they see it constantly, hear it constantly, and react to it constantly. Yet proximity without accountability is illusion. The constant presence of political figures in media does not mean they are being scrutinized. It often means they are being staged. As spectacle replaces accountability, the cost is paid quietly. Policies go unexplained, failures go uncorrected, and power goes largely unexamined. The noise creates the impression of chaos, but beneath it lies stability of a different kind, a system remarkably consistent in protecting itself while convincing the public that constant drama is evidence of transparency rather than its absence. The real struggle shaping this political moment is not between parties or personalities, but between public awareness and deliberate distraction. Power has always depended on controlling attention, and in the modern environment, attention is the most contested resource of all. When people begin to recognize patterns rather than reacting to isolated events, the balance starts to shift. That recognition is precisely what systems built on confusion work hardest to prevent. Distraction functions by fragmenting understanding. Instead of seeing connections between economic policy, political messaging, and social conflict, the public is encouraged to treat each issue as separate and urgent. Scandals erupt, cultural battles flare, and rhetorical crises dominate the news cycle, leaving little space for synthesis. The hook here is simple but unsettling. A distracted public can be loud, angry, and deeply engaged while remaining effectively powerless. Awareness, by contrast, is quieter but far more dangerous to entrenched interests. What makes awareness such a threat is its cumulative nature. Once people start connecting repeated patterns of behavior, individual explanations lose credibility. Excuses that once worked begin to sound familiar, then hollow. Voters notice how economic promises rarely translate into material improvement, how outrage spikes conveniently during moments of institutional vulnerability, and how accountability is endlessly postponed. Awareness does not require ideology, it requires memory, and memory undermines performance politics. This growing awareness also changes how messages are received. Provocation that once energized audiences begins to feel predictable. Fear based narratives lose impact when they are seen as tools rather than warnings. The emotional hooks still function, but their power diminishes as intent becomes visible. When people ask not just what is being said, but why it is being said now, control over the narrative weakens. The danger for those in power is that awareness spreads horizontally. It does not depend on centralized leadership or formal movements. Conversations, shared experiences, and repeated disappointments create a slow but persistent shift in perception. Individuals may disagree on solutions while agreeing on diagnosis, and that shared diagnosis is enough to disrupt the usual mechanisms of division. When economic stress, political spectacle, and cultural conflict are recognized as interconnected, distraction loses its isolating effect. This is why so much effort is invested in accelerating the news cycle. Speed prevents reflection. If audiences are constantly reacting, they have no time to analyze. Awareness requires pauses, comparisons, and context. Distraction thrives on immediacy. The more rapidly attention moves, the less likely it is to settle on systemic causes. Control is maintained not through censorship, but through saturation. Yet saturation has limits. People eventually sense repetition. They notice that despite endless debate, their material conditions remain unchanged. That realization creates a quiet skepticism that no slogan can fully erase. It is not revolutionary in tone, but it is transformative in effect. Once skepticism becomes widespread, political theater loses efficiency. The central tension, then, is whether awareness can outpace distraction. Every moment of clarity, every recognition of pattern weakens the grip of spectacle. The struggle is ongoing, uneven, and rarely dramatic, but it is decisive. Systems survive on confusion, and they falter when people begin to see how the pieces fit together.